Good evening, everyone. My name is Nelson Maldonado Torres, Director of the Rutgers Advanced Institute for Critical Caribbean Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural Combative book launch with Professor Aliyah Khan uh, and commentators, artists, and community organizers who are going to engage her book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean. I first would like to share a few words about the idea of combative book launches. So let me connect and share two slides that I have for you. The first one is based on a definition that Frantz Fanon offers of the concept of combative literature, which he defines as the will to liberty expressed in terms of time and space. This is also translated as the resolve situated in historical time. The will to liberty, Fanon understands it as effective responsibility, meant as the ability to respond, to become responsive, which is a concept that is different from simple ideals of tolerance advocated mainly in liberalism, including the liberal arts and sciences, and ideas and ideals of corporate efficiency, like in neoliberalism. And these ideas of tolerance and corporate efficiency are at the core of much of higher education today. The focus on combativity, understood as intolerance towards racism, and the effort to promote actions against racism is a concept that is trying to present a different framework or set of ideas or actions or vision about what higher education can be and research and knowledge production should be in the struggle against systemic racism, coloniality, and anti-Blackness. In that sense, the combative book launch starts from a number of presuppositions, one of which is that artists, activists, and community organizers and community elders have played a major role in generating ideas, concepts, images, and questions that are indispensable in Caribbean thought. Sorry. Combative book launches provide a platform for authors to be in conversation not only with professional academics, but also and particularly with artists, activists, community organizers, and our community elders, whose work contributes to the unfinished project of decolonization and to the struggle against anti-Blackness and systemic racism. The goal is to promote a decolonial and combative paradigm of knowledge production. The no concept of combativity, in addition to Fanon, it has been used and developed by thinkers like the South African intellectual Archie Mafeji. And also we have seen the concept of combativity emerge recently as in the struggles last year to oust the governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló, last summer in what is known as the combative summer of 2019. And we're building from um, these various um, these various initiatives, actions, forms of engagement to continue developing, fleshing out the meaning of combativity uh, in relation to the struggle against systemic racism, anti-Blackness, and coloniality. That I hope give you a sense of better sense of the idea of the combative. Um, the commentators will be addressing our text today, Far from Mecca, engaging questions such as what difference does it make for them to approach the book as poets, artists, organizers, what issues seem most important, what contributions seem most crucial, and how does the book speak to their practice. And I am now very pleased to introduce my former colleague at Rutgers, and she's one of the co-editors of the Critical Caribbean Studies book series. from Rutgers University Press, which is the press and the series under which this book today is published. And Professor Martinez San Miguel will join us to introduce Professor Aliyah Khan. Professor Martinez San Miguel, please.
Thank you, Professor Maldonado Torres. So I'm very happy here to actually represent the co-editors of the book series, the Critical Caribbean Studies, Matt Lopez and myself, and of course our editor, Kimberly Ginta. And as I will start the introduction by saying that I still remember in which we received the email from Kimberly, and she was basically like, she was very excited, like showing a new toy. And she had found the book that we were excited about because it reflected what we thought critical Caribbean should be doing, which is to question and unsettle and more knowledge of Caribbean studies. And so we read the proposal and we were immediately taken by the idea of the book. And so I'm going to include 3 quotes from that from the book, so you see the kinds of ideas that that the author promotes, and then I will introduce her. The first one, and they're very short. The first one is, not every Muslim in the Caribbean is Indian. Second, the book shows that the figure of the Fulama resists nor fully enters creolization, and there are fundamental postcolonial nationalisms in the Caribbean. And the third, the difference that Caribbean Islam, envisioned by most Caribbean people as a of indentured Indians, has traditionally posed to the Caribbean, that postcolonial space par excellence of creolization and hybridity, is one of a particularly ontologically identifiable in 2 ways by what it is not. First, it is not Hindu, and second, and more importantly, it is not Black. And so these ideas, and immediately we were like thinking, who is this new? And so I'm very happy to introduce Professor Aliyah Khan. She's an associate professor of English language and literature and Afroamerican and African Studies at the University of Michigan. And she's also a board member of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program in American culture. She holds a PhD in literature and feminist studies from the University of California, Cruz, MFA in fiction from Hunter College of the City University of. Her primary research areas are Caribbean literature and Muslim and Islamic literatures, with emphasis on race and sexuality. And she's the author, of course, of the book that we are discussing today, which is the history, literature, and music of Islam. Her writing also appears in scholarly journals, including GLQ, Caribbean Review of Gender and Studies in Canadian Literature, and popular venues, including the Rumpus, Agents of Ishak, and and writing. Dr. Khan is currently conducting research for a second book on Caribbean hurricanes and the ship routes of the transatlantic trade and their implications for contemporary migration within the hemispheric Americas. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking to ask Professor Khan for 1 second so that we see her, because she is going to come back at the end of the presentation, so that now you have a sense of her being here. So Aliyah, if you would mind just coming up for a second.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much, Yolanda, for that kind introduction. I look forward to speaking to you a little bit later.
Thank you so much. And I want to briefly introduce our conversation partners. Today, and what we will do is that then they will provide their comments about Professor Khan's text, and Professor Khan is going to enter in dialogue with them, respond, and offer some additional thoughts about the conversation that has already started and will continue in this setting. We count today with Simone Devi Jingur, who is a co-director of the organization Jihadi Sisters. She's an artist, social entrepreneur, and a body leadership coach who brings knowledge and expertise in program development, resource mobilization, organizational change, and event production. For over a decade, she has supported youth of color in New York City to become cultural and community organizers. She's committed to building the power of survivors of intimate partners and sexual violence to fight for gender justice in the Indo-Caribbean community. We also come with Shivana Jorah. She is the other co-director of Jihadi Sisters, and I very much encourage everybody to Google them. They have a very informative web page where you can find more information about the organization. Co-director Jorah is a queer first-generation Guyanese American and intersectional feminist who has served as a state legislative counsel at the Center for Reproductive Rights and directed federal policy advocacy at the National Abortion Federation. She's originally from the Bronx, holds a BA in political science from Fordham University and a JD from Emory University School of Law. And third, but not least, we have Professor and poet Rajiv Mohabir. Professor Mohabir is award-winning poet and professor of writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College. He's the author of The Cowherd's Son, which won the 2015 Condiment Prize, and The Taxidermist's Cut in 2016, which was selected by Brenda Shaughnessy for the 2014 Intro Prize in Poetry by Four Way Books. He's also the translator of I Even Regret, Holy Sons of Demerara, the only first-hand account of the mass displacement of people from the Anglophone Caribbean. It is a text that was originally published in 1916 by an indentured laborer. And without further ado, I will then let Professor and poet Rajiv Mohabir to start us off with an opening poem.
Thank you. The first, as a poem as an invocation that I'm going to read to you today is a translation of a Kabira. I chose this poem because it is both, it is written by the poet saint Kabir, who is important to both Hindu and Muslim communities in South Asia, and he speaks from these various communities. The one particular Kabira that I'm reading to you today is a translation, two deviant translations that is performed by the Trinidadian singer Yusuf Khan, originally recorded in 1980. And to elucidate some of the points found in this fabulous book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, this particular singer and song shows the kind of social distance and intermarrying that happens and occurs in the Caribbean space between religious identities. And this is also to elucidate one of the concerns of Dr. Khan's book about the poetic devices available to us. And this is my approach to this is a superficial gloss while holding the mysteries, spiritual and post-colonial concerns inside of different speech acts, and you'll see what I mean here. So you're going to journey with me in 3 languages in this transformation of this poem. And it's a poem that connects me, Aliyah Khan, Simone Jinkur, and Shivana Jorah. Aaj shavaliya sasure ghare jana. Aaj sawaliya sasure ghare jana. Chunari pehen ke piya se milenge sayya. Tum ho chatur sayana, sasure ghare jana. Jo yahu daag lagi chunari mein, tumko maar ke tana, sasure ghare jana. Kahte Kabira nirguna ki pad mein, samaja reh jana, sasure ghare jana, sasure ghare jana. Whatsoever you sabe, you must left You must left your papa house and all your by them. You must left your husband and all your bangle and churia where you get. You must left all the gold you get and all the silver too. You must left all the puja part and all the mantra tantra you learn for read. You must left, try to understand, Kabir saying bajan them. This side, how a kanwa go learn for read. This side, how a berawa go hiram. You are not from here, nor there. nor here. You are sure to go back. You attend to fancy silks and clever dress. Even though you are wise, this body is not yours. It will always be stained with sinew and blood, a veil between you and the sunlight. You think, at last, at last. Feverish, you page through the holy texts, trusting your eyes to see. Looking like this, you will never understand. You are not from here, nor here. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Rajiv, for the wonderful gift and opening of this session. And with this, we're going to pass the mic to Simone Jingur and Shivana Jorah from Jihadi Sisters. Please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Simone Jingur, and I'm the co-director of Jihadi Sisters, along with Shivana Jorah. Thank you so much for Rajiv for that beautiful offering. I really felt that. So we're so grateful to be part of the first Combative book launch event with Dr. Aliyah Khan, and to be engaging in dialogue with you about your new book, which is an important and necessary contribution to the field of Caribbean studies. I've known Aliyah for many years now. We were in undergrad together at Hunter College, and I'm personally delighted to be reconnecting with her in this way. Thank you again for this invite. Thank you, Nelson, for organizing this. So we'd like to start by just sharing a bit about Jihadi Sisters and the work that we do. Shivana and I co-founded Jihadi Sisters in 2007, along with several other Indo-Caribbean women, Tej Motilal, Vijay Kublal, Shabana Sharif, Preeta Singh, Suzanne Persard, and Jacqueline Latif Scully. It feels important to name the contributions of all of these women who gave much of their time and their heart to create the foundation for Jihadi Sisters. The work would not be where it is now if it weren't for their vision, their passion, and their commitment for transforming our community. And what we were modeling then and are continuing to model today is the solidarity that was embodied by our foremothers, the Jihadi Behen. We're women of diverse Indo-Caribbean backgrounds. We're Guyanese, we're Trini, we're Jamaican, we're Hindu, and we're Muslim, and we're Christian. And coming together to address the gender injustices that women and gender expansive people in our community are facing. Jihadi Sisters envisions a world where women, girls, and all people across the gender spectrum are safe and thriving. Jihadi Sisters is a survivor-centered gender justice organization activating Indo-Caribbeans in New York to address the root causes of gender-based violence. Our community of support guides survivors to heal, recover, and thrive. Through arts activism, leadership development, and grassroots organizing, we amplify community voices and visions to transform culture. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we came to be. And I love sharing our founding story. So Jihadi Sisters was founded in 2007 when we organized the very first Indo-Caribbean Women's Empowerment Summit. Vijay Kublal, an older leader in our community, was encountering countless women who were dealing with domestic violence and needed support, but just didn't have anyone to talk to or any place that they could go to get connected to resources. And she wanted to do something about it. She saw that there was a problem and she wanted to work on fixing it, right? And so she reached out to my older sister, Tej, who is my co-conspirator in all things social justice. And then Tej reached out to me. And, you know, I remember us sitting at Auntie Vijay's kitchen table, planning the first Indo-Caribbean Women's Empowerment Summit. But also we were just reeling emotionally from the news of Natasha Raymond's murder. So Natasha Raymond was a young Indo-Caribbean woman who was about 22 years old. She had filed charges against her rapist and he was released on bail. He went to her apartment where she lived, and as she was getting ready to leave for work one morning, he ended up murdering her. And this was something that made like the mainstream newspapers. You know, and I also remember as I was sitting there reeling emotionally and working with them to think through what the summit could look like, I was silently and shamefully just struggling myself to exit an abusive relationship. And so our summit was this beautiful gathering of an intergenerational group of Indo-Caribbean women who were breaking the silence on violence, who were able to share our stories and speak our truth. Something that, a space that, you know, wasn't always allowed for in our community, right? I think I remember we had several men who were like trying to RSVP and attend, and they're like, why can't we be there? And they had to drop off their wives and then leave, which I think was really strange for them. But at that summit, where we had about 50 to 75 women, we engaged in a patriarchy 101 workshop, and we dialogued about the ways our culture, which includes our spiritual traditions, perpetuates patriarchy and misogyny. So 2 months later in May, after the summit, which happened in March, Gayatri Hardat was killed. She was a 23-year-old Indo-Caribbean woman who was shot on Atlantic Avenue by her ex-Indo-Caribbean fiance. And again, the news made all the mainstream papers, but the all boys club in our community, the older male leaders who arrived here in the 70s and were focused on cultural preservation, who came together for many other things, didn't respond to this. And all of this catalyzed the birth of Jihadi Sisters. We were disgusted, we were enraged, and we knew that we needed to be the leaders who were going to organize for gender justice in our community. So there's a reason why we chose the name Jihadi Sisters. We were previously called the Indo-Caribbean Women's Empowerment Group. And after our 2008 summit, we decided it was time to rename the organization. We chose Jihadi Sisters because of its historical meaning and what it represented for us. Our ancestors came from different regions in South Asia. They spoke different languages, they had different faiths, they were Muslim and they were Hindu. But what was powerful was the way they were able to connect and build solidarity despite those factors. United in their sitting in the uncertainty of what future was ahead of them, they became chosen family. They became ship sisters. They were able to draw on collective strength and resilience to survive the journey to the Caribbean and whatever else they would have to face. And this is the spirit we wanted to evoke in our name and how we wanted to organize for gender justice. And I'm going to pass it to Shiv, who's going to just share a little bit more about our work.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much, Simone, for that. I really want to thank you, Aliyah, Dr. Khan, for this offering. You know, it's really rare. I don't know if folks who are watching this understand and can comprehend how amazing it is for us to be seen out in the world and to see ourselves out in the world. You know, as Rajiv was reading his poem and Ajasawania, right? That took me back to, I think I danced that song back in the day. And it just does something to you in your body that you can't control. And I'm not a like supremely romantic or emotional person, but things like that, especially when we see them outside of our community, I think just make us feel this sense of acceptance, right? And there's so little out there about us as a community, much less about us by us. So thank you so much, Aliyah, and also for the intersectional approach, right? The fact that you're talking about gender and the African Caribbeans and the Indo-Caribbeans, and it just feels like it's a really different kind and more comprehensive contribution to what is currently out there. So just much gratitude to you. And just a little bit more about Jihadi Sisters and what we do. We do our work, so this is getting into our methodology, through leadership development, grassroots organizing, healing, justice, and arts activism. And what we aim to do in the world is shift culture and uproot patriarchy once and for all, so that oppression does not exist. And so we're really about getting to the root of the problem, right? We're not a direct service organization. We really want to change hearts and minds and create transformation. And so our biggest programs are about, you know, changing who is a leader in our community, building feminist leaders, giving them the tools and skills that they need to go out there and demand change for themselves, and also around healing for them, because we're survivor-centered, right? So the folks who we serve and the folks in our leadership, these are people who have gone through or are currently going through sexual violence, gender-based violence, and we believe that because they're closest to the issue, they're the people that are closest to the solutions, right? And so for them to be their biggest, boldest selves and actually be able to get us there, to get us to freedom and to liberation, we do a lot of healing work with them so that they can find their strength. So Simone and I arranged how we're going to do this, and I'm going to get into a little bit of my takeaways from the book, and then I'll pass it over to her. We might have a little bit of back and forth as we are used to as co-directors. Again, the Jihadi spirit and solidarity at play. You know, the chapter about gender, Aliyah, really, really spoke to me, and I was tearing up during parts of it. And again, I just feel so appreciative for many things in the book, but one thing that really kind of stirred my spirit and gave me an awakening about myself was the piece where you speak about our ancestral mothers, the first Jihadis, right? The Jihadis on the ship, being people who had broken out of the gender box in some way, shape, or form, right? So they were folks who were on the margins of society, sex workers, you know, widows, people who, because of their circumstances, ended up being with many men and just living in ways that, you know, were not traditional. And for me, one of the things that I've really struggled with as an Indo-Caribbean person and as an activist in our community is, you know, there's kind of this, as a people who have been separated, you know, there's this double migration that we've gone through, and there's this feeling of intense separation from the motherland, right? And because of that, we're a little bit obsessed with our ancestors, you know, and we look to them for strength and for inspiration. And I certainly have, but at the same time, I've also thought to myself, you know, as a queer person, as someone who is well into my 30s and unmarried, right? As someone who is, you know, out and bold and outspoken, am I even the kind of person that my ancestors would want around them, you know? Like, actually, would I be the person that they talk bad about and say, don't be like that one over there, you know? So it's been difficult for me to reconcile those two things, where I see their strength and resilience, you know, and honor and invoke them, but also feel the distance, you know? And so the kind of shedding new light on who the ancestors are, because when I think of ancestors, I usually think about like, okay, grandmother, great grandmother, you know, and those folks definitely like haven't approved of my way of life. But you've made me think about like the Indo-Caribbean female ancestor in a really different way, in a way that makes me wonder, would they actually see themselves in me, you know? And one of the things that people have been saying in movement for a little while now is, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, right? And for a good while, I would hear that and feel like, probably not. But now, you know, I feel like, oh, maybe I am those ancestors' wildest dreams. And I feel like there's like an acceptance that has emerged because of what you've written there. And I think the piece about, you know, juxtaposing Sita and Rand, which is like our own personal Indo-Caribbean Madonna whore complex, you know, so Sita is a Hindu goddess who is the partner of a really, really lauded god named Shiva, my namesake actually. And she is known for being submissive, for serving him, waiting on him hand and foot. She is known for, when she is charged, accused wrongly of infidelity, throwing herself into a fire pit to prove her purity. You know, so those are the lengths that Hindu women and Indo-Caribbean women are kind of expected to go through to prove their worth and their value, right? And I think, you know, it's not just for Hindu women, as Aliyah has said in her book. Sita also became kind of this idol role model for what Muslim women were supposed to be, because in the Caribbean, Muslims and Hindus kind of ended up falling under one category, right? So I think that's really interesting, and also the relation to anti-Blackness there too really struck me, because there's this piece about, you know, you want to be Sita, you don't want to be the Rand that perhaps you were when you first came on that Jihadi ship. So there's this like a reshaping of the Indo-Caribbean woman that happens. And to me, it feels like, at least in part, that was done to differentiate the Indians from the Black folks, right? And to make them feel better than, and to me, it feels so much like the model minority myth that we have here in the United States of Asian Americans wanting to feel, and you know, this is a divide and conquer methodology here, wanting to feel like they're better than Blacks, like they're healthy, wealthy, and wise, you know, rich, smart, all of that. So if they can do it, then Black folks can do it too, you know, and kind of reinforcing these negative ideas of Black folks as lazy, so on and so forth. And so I feel like it's our like model woman myth, right? Because at the end of the day, Indo-Caribbean women were and still are whole people with healthy sexualities, and who speak up for ourselves and have opinions, you know? So I thought that that was really poignant too. And the idea that women's agency, I mean, and this is pervasive throughout every culture, but I think there's a distinguishing factor here, that women's agency is bad. Because it makes men die, right? There's this part about suicide that you write about, and I think it's a story of Aliyah, whose Nani, her grandmother, she had agency. She was this smart, brilliant woman who led, you know, labor unrests, and her husband, who broke gender norms in his own way because he was a dancer, felt emasculated by her agency, right? And by her being her whole self, to the point where he fell into such a deep depression and killed himself, right? And she feels bad about that. And she is having fingers pointed at her, and she's being told that she is the reason. And that kind of being a going theme in the community, I think, onto today, right? Like, we're told that you know, it's uncommon that we should be more educated and make more money than our husbands, right? So just, you know, some of the things that really struck me, and that I also feel have not disappeared. Like, they're very much present today. There's a piece, Aliyah, too, where you talk about you know, women being sheltered and kept in the domestic sphere. Just the other day, I was looking for volunteers. You know, we do a lot of grocery deliveries nowadays. I can't find women who can drive these deliveries to people's homes because, you know, in our community, women are not really, you know, taught to drive as much as boys are. We're taught to stay home. We don't have friends. We don't, you know, go out to parties. We don't go away to college. We don't travel. You know, not to be essentialist, because of course some folks do, but that is like the idea of what it is to be a good Indo-Caribbean woman. So I think that, you know, the threads that you identified are still continuing to today. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chef. So because of the work that we do, we both were just really drawn to the chapter on gender. And so there's like so many great things that came up in that chapter that I also want to just lift up. But one theme that came up for me that I felt was like the most moving and powerful was just the idea of the revolutionary Jihadi Bahin and the ways Indo-Caribbean women have and can continue to reject that archetype, right? That idea of the idealized cultural norm of the submissive, passive woman. And so like when I think about the journey of our ancestors to cross over from South Asia to the Caribbean, I often reflect on my own great-grandmother's story, which is not so different from many other family stories. You know, I often heard from my nanny that she was kidnapped, you know, she left her husband and her son behind. She was a woman who was alone and pregnant on the ship with my great-grandfather when she arrived in Guyana. And when I think about her and I try to imagine her story, and I often write a lot about her, I think about the trauma of separation she had from her family. And I don't always think about her courage or her agency. So I love that your book has flipped that narrative for me through your unpacking of Shah's book, A Silent Night. So Aliyah, the character in Shah's book, was the inheritor of the courage of Nani and other female plantation workers who protested colonial regimes. She was the inheritor of Sumitra and Kausilia's legacy of resistance. She moves on her own terms in the spirit of her revolutionary grandmother and other women who raised their voices. And I love that so much. And there's also a part in chapter 2 where you reference the writer Mecca, who says that Hindu women had the most to gain by crossing over to different lands because their confinement in patriarchal structures in India made them victims of abusive family and communal traditions. And I imagine this wasn't so different for Muslim women either, right? So a widow or sex worker or a married woman who was resisting this exerted their agency over their life to make that courageous choice to leave it all behind. And I'm thinking now about my own great-great-grandmother and what if I flipped her story into thinking, you know, she didn't leave her husband and her son behind. She was walking away from a life that she just didn't want anymore. And she saw the possibility of living a new life where she could have more power and agency over who she wanted to be. So I just think that revelation was just really moving and powerful for me. And then there's also this piece around, you know, the freedom that women had as indentured laborers once they arrived in the Caribbean. There's a freedom that women had over their bodies and their sexuality. You know, they were in a position to choose and be with whoever they desired. But then there were also these attempts to silence this freedom and the way indentured men, whether it was through preconditioned patriarchal values that they brought with them, or from the colonial trauma, you know, they murdered and they mutilated women that they desired to control. And Shivana Jorah in her book, Holy Women, talks about this a lot. She describes it as those fits of jealous rage that caused indentured women to lose their lives and to be violently harmed. You know, we read about how they had their noses chopped off, they had their hands chopped off, things that could make them look less beautiful and less desirable. And, you know, we know that there's a legacy of gender-based violence that we continue to see play out today in our community. And so the other interesting thing to note, and you talk about this too, is the way that later generations of women return to the Sita ideal, right? The patriarchal family structure and their attempts to preserve their Indian culture, which is inclusive of their faith traditions, right? So I just wanted to read just an excerpt that I thought was pretty cool. I show overall that A Silent Life is a Jihadi Bahin ship sister narrative predicated on a rejection of Indo-Guyanese heterosexist morality and the concomitant remembrance of the Indian ancestress as she was, not the Ramayanic Sita ideal of sainted mother and submissive wife adopted by Indo-Caribbean migrants, but a labor leader or a sex worker or any number of other identities, including wife and mother. The indentured woman had much more freedom of movement, relationships, and sexuality than did her daughter and even granddaughter, who were charged with reforming the Indo-Caribbean domestic sphere and community through chaste and silent performance as wife and mother. So, I mean, it's not something new, but that idea that you could come to a new place and have so much agency and freedom over who you want to be and the life that you want to lead, to then have to, you know, to then have later generations reject that for whatever reasons, right? Mostly because it was about preserving our culture. Like, what does that mean? Like, why did that happen? And I love how you talk about Aliyah, you know, like disrupting that and rejecting that. Aliyah, who had a nanny who was like a labor activist, who was channeling the spirit of the other ancestor who came on the boat and chose to marry a Muslim man. She was Hindu, but she chose to marry this Muslim man, and then built all these like beautiful relationships with the other women who were on the ship, who became her chosen family, and who gave her like a mati khor. And the mati khor has always traditionally been that place where women can exert their sexuality, right? Where they can talk about sex and show, teach like younger women who are getting married what sex is. So I just thought that parallel was really beautiful too. And I love Aliyah's character and who she is and what she represents for our generation of Indo-Caribbean women. So I think as an activist and an organizer who's engaged with this book, I want us to remember that as Indo-Caribbean women, we are the revolutionary Jihadi Bahin. You know, there's a legacy of the way feminism has showed up in our history and continues to show up. And I just want to leave us with one more reference in your book that I really liked and enjoyed. In 1930s British Guyana, Aliyah's grandmother, Nani, Gayatri's granddaughter, is no domestic Sita. Though married, Nani is an outspoken young woman who acquires a reputation for helping poor Indian women and male sugar and rice workers by offering them the vision of organized labor. Nani acquires socialist principles from the mysterious Pandit Sicharan, a Hindu religious leader, even while fraternizing with Hindus is frowned upon for a Muslim woman. Nani is bright enough to understand workers' rights ideologies and fiery enough to electrify others when she repeats them. I mean, a Nani who knows about socialism and Marxist ideology is just like so dope, but yeah. The revolutionary Jihadi Bahin shows us that a woman and gender expansive person can be in their full power, can take up space in their home and their work and their community and lead purposeful lives. We can debunk that notion that doing any and all of this might overshadow and emasculate the Indo-Caribbean man. And at Jihadi Sisters, we know that there's a lot of cultural shift work that needs to be done to uproot the patriarchy, to smash that patriarchy in our community, which shapes our values and our norms, right? And one of the ways that we can do this is by lifting up inspiring feminist icons in both Islam and Hinduism. So there's also like Aisha, who you talk about. And like, I've actually never knew a whole lot about any kind of feminist icons in Islam. So I love learning about Aisha. And I think about Kali in Hinduism. You know, Kali, who's this warrior that all the male gods could not destroy this evil demon. So they had to come together to create this powerful warrior who was the one that could actually save the world from darkness. And I think, you know, as part of the cultural shift work, we do need to be lifting up more of these feminist stories in both religions to just show the possibility of who we can be as Indo-Caribbean women.
Thank you so much to both of you, Simone and Shivana. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Rajiv.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelson and Yolanda, for organizing this, and also Shivana and Simone for some really compelling points to think over around the different kinds of activisms and feminisms that can activate and enliven the topics in this fabulous book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, and what it points to. I'd like to also thank Dr. Aliyah Khan for asking me to be part of this panel discussion and Combative book launch. I'm so excited by your ideas and articulations around the Muslim Caribbean. as a literary citizen, as a literary person, but also a person living in time and space. I also want to say congratulations for this beautifully produced book. It's such a joy, and this is like the most superficial thing to say, I suppose, but it's such a joy to like hold, and the pages and the ink, it's just so, it's like a beautiful object too, and I just kind of want to marvel at the fact. And then, yeah, I'm going to start my conversation reading a poem that's called Butchering a Hen, in which I imagine and remember an ancestor who, you know, is obscured through my own family history, who orphaned on the boat from India to the Caribbean, or to Guyana, was Muslim, according to family story. And so Butchering a Hen positions me and my mother in a conversation around doing the act. And this is a poem after RAICCS poems. First, pull the breast up from the legs until the hollow echoes, the bones scrape on steel, and tear apart the ribs and hips, cartilage snapping, and by then the plastic wrap will drip in syrup that's not quite blood, but a diluted death that opens its maw or begs for the shreds of fat and skin. I have learned not to render into the ache of an artery or another indenture story. Sabu's stallion galloping across the sky, Aladdin's Persian or Mowgli's elephant, this vessel of curry will taste like eating sandalwood coals, stinking of the Orient, but not the Orient of Jalal ad-Din or nor of Kabir, who, as I understand it, was all woof and wool, and even worse, a vegetarian. Instead of chanting any name, I'd rather tear the flesh of a bird like the banyan does, roots eating stone and corpses of the minas that congregate, crowding evening with their salah and tantra mantras. My own hands, my mother's hands, knobby. A mango would, Bismillah, like Lala's madras curry powder, or my mother's knuckles, amma, orphaned with Muslim and Hindu earrings, like water stirred into milk, mixed in Chennai, a ghost now frying in Oviedo, Florida, hungry for pink flesh. And her mother's name, now a flame-licked pot, and now a slow boil, something unremembered, that still stings and burns, and blindly I tear the roti and sop up what pools, with oil stewed into something new, tearing muscle from bone, my fingers smeared with pepper sauce. I come to this conversation as a poet and translator. What this book does for me, the Far From Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, it enlivens discussions around the potential for art, and particularly poetry, around creating and deepening solidarities between religious communities and ethnic divides that separate and challenge the Caribbean spaces that we move through, whether in a post-election Guyana, in Trinidad, or in New York City. What Dr. Khan's book does is to cause me to pause and to consider the potential for writing to be transgressive, to cross the seas again, but into the neighbor's house. As in the United States, Black folks are rising up around us against a government that seeks to destroy their psychic and bodily sovereignties. Dr. Khan introduces the concept and the device of batin to me as a reader, and it makes me think of ways that meanings can be hidden in poetry. Certainly, as I began to write poems, I hid my own queer feelings in obscure and obtuse lines. There was a danger that I sensed living in my own home of Guyanese immigrants. In her book, and in chapter 2, the scholar talks about how the poet Abdul Rahman Glade Hopkins hides his Sufi faith in poetry in the face of compulsory Christianity of Jamaica. The specific examples that she gave were from Black Caribbean writers who were Muslim. I think this works for my own ideas of poetry and translation, especially when I consider the ideas of retrospectatorship and how they interact with batin and the hidden meaning. Rather, that those in the know or the in-group are able to understand and see themselves, though direct meanings and one-to-one correlations of words to meaning are obscured for reasons of safety. In this way, batin transcends just being a Kuli poetic or a Black poetic, but unites the various ethnic groups in Guyana under a flag of resistance embedded in literary tradition. I like this concept of an Indo-Caribbean person having the potential to work with non-Indo-Caribbean groups to achieve an anti-colonial end. It helps to produce a new way of understanding the divine yearning as a metaphor for acting in solidarity with other communities. What if it also meant longing for uniting between people to fight the threat and prospect of a Protestant work ethic now that oil companies are descending on the Demerara? I'm going to read in conversation with this before I break down the poetic devices that I've mined from this book. To help me, I will show you it in action and then end with talking about these ideas and then showing them again enlivened. So bear with me in my poetry mind. We are watching Black people die disproportionately in the United States. COVID-19 threatening Black communities, the police hunting Black bodies. It's time to become the ancestors who fought for Black liberation. My sister gave birth on February 20th, 2020, to a Black child with eyes like moons. She gave birth to a Black child in the middle of a global pandemic, a moonrise in the middle of a global pandemic. What new world will I help to create for my Saya? This poem came to me as a prayer while considering my extended family's anti-Black racism in the United States, Canada, and England. Being Guyanese immigrants for their generation meant fleeing oppressive regimes only to come to this country to vilify Black bodies. What does it mean to be in a precarious body, to be brown and to ally with family and friends despite the define and rule lingering in our psyches, gifted to us by our colonial masters? What about how Hinduism is now being mobilized against Black communities and continually mobilized against Black communities in Guyanese and Caribbean practice? And what about how Hinduism is a machine for Savarna oppression mobilized into anti-Muslim and anti-Dalit violence? What if I am a queer and have ancestors with unknown and Dalit histories? And these are some questions that I've been grappling with. I do know that somewhere in my ancestry were casteless people who fought for the rights and the rights of people around them. This is my invocation. Daughter of sea, child of mountain. In mornings of thick gravity, to see through tears and police tear gas, against the government's buffalo head impervious to man, make me queer and animal. Place in my hands your lotus of creation, your trident of ruin, that I may gallop tigerback, teeth bared, loose-haired, that I may trample under red foot injustice. Hindus who raise Dalit and masjid. America that smashes Black bodies under knee. Here, I raise your sword. Ma, I am your conch. As I read through Far From Mecca, I looked for poetic devices that I could use to prove an anti-colonial solidarity as a way to mobilize the practice of poetry, to propel the discourse into the future without dwelling in the darkened room of nostalgia. And these are some of the poetic devices that I've seen, and I'm making a list. And one day, if it becomes a chapbook on poetics in practice, I will dedicate it to Far From Mecca and these folks. So, the approach of biomythography that Dr. Khan uses is descended of Audre Lorde and experiential And it's based in literary and experiential, by writing the self and the stories of one's people. There's also the poetic device of moving beyond the past. So how poetry is not a project of nostalgia or traumatic loss. However, it is something that moves us forward in time. There's also the potential of something like a Jose Poetics, a time of celebration between communities that threatened colonial authority. And this is kind of a very magical thing to think about, especially now where we are sitting. There's also Tawheed, excuse me, that is linked with Batin in this book, as literary practices that encourage union with the love and oneness of the beloved Allah, providing ways of articulating and surviving enslavement and its legacy, the omnipresent Caribbean agony of traumatic loss of freedom, bodily autonomy, and the cultural and religious knowledge. There's Taqiyya, which I invoked kind of superficially in the beginning, which is the providing of a superficial gloss of the meaning of a text while withholding the mysteries and hiding the part that why I'm calling it my interpretation in the original as superficial is because I'm not hiding the religious meaning in a time of persecution, and this is actually an important part of it. There's the signature of the poem by the poet, the Taqalus, or the Kabichap. There's the Carib pastoral, which is this anti-colonial nation-building symbolism offered by Guyana's diverse continental jungle, savanna, and riverine landscapes in which indigenous tribal people still live. There's the ideas of marvelous realism, the use of humor, and Jihadi Bai solidarities, which is a really fascinating conversation that Dr. Khan engages with in terms of Jihadi Bai as well as Jihadi Blues written by Brother Marvin, Selwyn Deming, and who claims that it ought to have been an appellation, the term Jihadi Bai, used between Indian and Afro-Trinidadians to talk about a solidarity that could be approached. And I think that as a device, this could be used if concerns and care is taken to avoid the pitfalls of what BG, Gregory Valentine's song, Jihadi Blues, critiques. And so I end here with this kind of explosion that's happening in my mind as I read through the potential of poetry in this time that we are surviving together, where we are learning to be better allies and to show up for people in various communities. And so thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that wonderful reflection. Thanks to the three commentators for the spectacular display of wisdom and passion. And I would now leave the space to Dr. Khan then to give a response and to continue the conversation.
Thank you again, everyone, for being here today. I'd like to particularly thank Nelson for organizing this event and for the innovation of this model of a community-based book launch. I'd like to also thank Yolanda for introducing me, and of course, Rajiv, Simone, and Shivana for giving their time to be such thoughtful and creative interlocutors. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, but after hearing what you all had to say before I start discussing my book, I want to address Rajiv, Shivana, and Simone directly as members of the same Indo-Caribbean community of which I'm a member and that I was born into and that motivates me to do this kind of work. Rajiv, you and I have spoken specifically about Ajasawalya. Both about it in the sense of its locational specificity as a soundtrack of our childhoods, our Indo-Caribbean childhoods, as well as its transnational reach, right? It's Yusuf Khan's song from 1980 Trinidad, but it's also Kabir's Nirgun Bajan. I mean, it is such a perfect representation of the kind of not transnational, not just transnational, but the work with the kind of long temporal reach that we are trying to do here. And then Shivana and Simone, I really I don't know how to even express the gratitude that our community owes you for the work that you do. What Jihadi Sisters has done is expose the kind of silences that are the result of the things like domestic violence, suicide, and the silences surrounding those kinds of things that are a distinct legacy of plantation violence that continue into today in all of these very ugly ways. And, Jihadi Sisters is essentially the first organization that is attempting to address on the ground, at least in the Indo-Caribbean diaspora in the United States, the legacies of this kind of plantation violence. It's also really nice to see all of you again. So I'll start off by, as I said, I'll speak for about 15 minutes, and I'll start off by giving a general overview of my book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, and my motives for writing it, in the interest of thinking about writing an academic book itself combatively, as Nelson was saying, with a Fanonian will to liberty. I'm going to share my screen with you, so let's just see if this works. All right. So Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean is not a value-neutral academic project in which I have no political or personal investment. I actually think academic objectivity is a more or less disingenuous proposition, especially if we are thinking along decolonial lines, as we are doing. I will also say some things about the historical and socio-political characterization of Islam in the English-speaking Caribbean and in its diasporas, specifically as related to the poetic and organizing questions raised by the other panelists. As several people have pointed out, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean is the first academic monograph, not the first academic work, but monograph, on the literature and music of Islam and Muslims in the Caribbean. I'm saying that deliberately to point out that there is a significant regional and temporal gap in the hemispheric American study of Islam and Muslims, which tends to focus on contemporary Muslim immigrant communities to the United States. One of my major roles in writing this book was to decenter the place of the United States in the study of Muslims in the Americas. Most other texts specifically on Islam in the Caribbean are anthologies or histories. There's also a certain genre of security studies work that addresses terrorism. I do talk about the global hot topic of Islam, Muslim migration, and terrorism, but my lens is the multiplicity of Caribbean Muslims' cultural production. As my interlocutors have pointed out, their fiction, their poetry, and their music, and what that means for community formation. There are many, many Muslims with diverse histories in Latin America and the Caribbean. Muslim and Islamic American studies cannot be defined solely as the study of 20th and 21st century Arab, South Asian, Persian, Turkish, West African, and other Muslim immigration to the United States and Canada, with its temporal pivot point at September 11, 2001, when the story of Muslims in the Americas instead began in the colonial era with two enslaved groups, Iberian Maghrebi Moriscos, or Moors, and West African Muslim victims of the transatlantic slave trade. I always like to start with a map whenever I'm teaching classes and, for talks too. Before 1990, Islam in the Caribbean was figured almost solely as a minority religious legacy of, as people were discussing, the 1838 to 1917 British, Dutch, and French importation of indentured laborers from India to the sugar plantation of the Caribbean, following the manumission of African slaves in the British colonies. That is, this resulted in both Muslims and non-Muslims thinking of Islam as an Indian religion in the Caribbean, ignoring the colonial presence of enslaved West African Muslims in the region. Most indentured Indian Muslims, like their Hindu counterparts, ended up in the colonies of British Guyana, which is now Guyana, as you can see here, Trinidad, Jamaica, and Suriname. Between 6 to 10% of Indian indentured laborers in the Caribbean were Muslim. Present-day Guyana and Trinidad are two former British Caribbean colonies that are demographically almost evenly split between the descendants of African slaves and the descendants of Indian indentured laborers. After colonialism, the main state actors in conflict with each other, to which some of the panelists have indirectly alluded, have been Afro-Caribbean Christians pitted against Indo-Caribbean Hindus and Muslims. As noted, Muslims are commonly understood in the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, to be Indian. But that is changing, partly as a result of contemporary Afro-Caribbean conversion, or as some people prefer to term it, reversion to Islam. So in Far From Mecca, I deliberately put Afro-Caribbean majority and Indo-Caribbean minority histories and literatures in dialogue with each other, rather than treating them separately, as most Caribbean historical works and literary works do. I argue for a historical continuity of Muslim presence and cultural production in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, from autobiographical fragments of colonial slavery and indenture, to 20th century Black nationalist Muslim narratives in music, to contemporary judicial and fictional accounts of the interaction between Caribbean Muslims and the figure of the global terrorists. My methodology is interdisciplinary. It is primarily literary analysis, which is my training, but using archival research, ethnography, historiography, postcolonial critical theory, and cultural and gender studies to fill those silences in the archives that Yolanda initially referred to. There are, for example, 2 major interviews woven throughout the literary and musical textual analysis. One interview is with Yassin Abu Bakr, leader of the Trinidadian Jamaat al-Muslimin, who perpetrated a 1990 Islamic coup against the government of Trinidad and who occupies the imagined place of the originary Caribbean Muslim terrorists in the view of both Trinidadians and the United States government. The second major interview is with Anissa Ahmad, a medical Trinidadian doctor who in 1995 was the first Muslim woman to give a khutbah Friday sermon in a Caribbean mosque. I want to specifically address something that Shivana and Simone said too about thinking about our female ancestresses in the Caribbean and how we might bring that into the work that we are doing, whether it is academic or activist or poetic. There is some personal and family history in my book. It is really unavoidable when you are writing about a community that is your own, and I don't think that you should spend time avoiding it. As Rajiv pointed out, this personal and family history is in the spirit of Grenadian Carriacou Caribbean American activist and author Audre Lorde's concept of biomythography, where the story of a subaltern people who have been oppressed and elided from history can be told through and with the story of the individual. The Rutgers University Press cover of Far From Mecca that you see here features a photograph of a group of Muslim women in colonial British Guyana that includes my relatives. My grandmother, Farida Rashid, my mother, Salima, and my aunt, Nazima, as children. I don't see any particular need to elide the non-objective fact that I am a Muslim who was born in Guyana and that this is nonetheless an academic book on Muslims in the Caribbean. Far From Mecca argues above all that the Caribbean Muslim subject, whom I call by the Guyanese term for a Muslim of any race, the Fulaman, has never been fixed or static, and it neither resists nor fully enters the discourses of creolization and syncretism that are fundamental to post-colonial nationalisms in the Caribbean. Fulaman, a term that some of you might know, is a Guyanese Muslim term that is derived from the West African tribal term Fula or Fulani, some of whom were Muslims enslaved in the Americas. Fulani itself is derived from the Arabic word fulan, meaning so or what's his name, occurring in the storytelling name Said Fulan or Mr. X. In Trinidad, the term Mandingo or Madinga, from the tribal name Mande or Mandinka, occupies the same linguistic and social place, an African tribal name that now denotes any Muslim in that Caribbean country. For the Fulaman, the inaccurately framed ideological question in the Caribbean is usually whether he or she will choose creolized Caribbean culture or a religious Islamic purity that is associated either with the Arab Middle East or with African and Indian origins. I show that Fulaman is a performative identity. I argue that the forms and the boundaries of the Caribbean Muslim are not fixed, but they shift and are made temporarily real by gendered and racialized moments of action and reaction. In particular, when the dress and moral behavior of Muslim women are policed by Muslims and non-Muslims, and when Islam, a religion, functions as a racial category in the hemispheric Americas. After a 1990 attempted government coup in Trinidad by the predominantly Afro-Trinidadian Muslim group, the Jamaat al-Muslimin, and also accelerated by post-9/11 hemispheric concerns, Islam in the Caribbean has been implicated in US discourses on terrorism, without attention to the particularities of the Caribbean's historical relationship to Islam. Islam, as shown in the book, is viewed by governments and by many people in the Caribbean and elsewhere as a transnational but inherently foreign religion. The regressive conservatism and incompatibility with Caribbean citizenship of which are defined by local multi-ethnic adherents, gender, dress, and bodily performances. To think further about issues raised by the panelists, I'll turn now to examples of some of the specific ways in which race and gender, two of the major concerns that came up, intersect with Islam in the Caribbean. It is impossible to determine how many African Muslims were enslaved in the Americas, but it is crucial that we understand that they were. West African Muslims often distinguish themselves by their literacy and writing in the Americas. One example I discuss in the book is this one that you see on your screens. It's Muhammad Kaba Sargunugu's 1820 Sufi Qadiriya autobiographical treatise on Islam, the Kitab al-Salat, or the Book on Praying. Kaba, a native of Buka in northern Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, arrived in Jamaica in 1777 at the age of 21 and died in 1845, still enslaved. He wrote this manuscript from memory in his 60s. These opening pages, read right to left, begin on the top right with the Basmala, the Islamic invocation that begins every chapter of the Quran except one. That is, if you can read it, it's actually quite clear here. It's Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. As Rajiv discussed, there are many palimpsestic layers, and actually you can see this text itself is a palimpsest. There are some things that are erased and written over, but in any case, there are some also metaphorical palimpsestic layers of literary and religious meanings here. Batin essentially is a Sufi word for hidden, the Sufi, Muslim religious word for hidden. So the question is, what is hidden in this manuscript? What is hidden here? There are many things, including the fact that in the case of this enslaved man, that he was in fact still a Muslim, even though he professed Christianity at one point. As Sylviane Diouf shows, from the 15th century onward, male and female Quranic literacy was highly valued in the Muslim theocracies of West Africa, and many enslaved Muslims from Timbuktu in Mali, Fouta Djallon in Guinea, and other areas could read and write in both Arabic and Ajami, the generic name for West African languages, including Fulani and Hausa, that were translated into Arabic script. In the Caribbean and North America, racial typologizing of Africans combined with Muslim literacy produced in white plantation society a belief that the Fulani and Mandinka were racially superior by dint of their alleged straighter hair, their quote unquote less glossy black skin, and their proposed North African, Iberian, Muslim, Arab admixture. British Jamaican planter Brian Edwards, for example, wrote in 1794 of his slaves knowing the quote Al-Quran, and he considered the Muslim Fulani racially superior to other Africans, and therefore not well adapted for hard labor. Such planter attitudes sometimes resulted in better treatment for enslaved African Muslims on Caribbean plantations. Diouf writes that Muslims distinguished themselves amongst the rest of the enslaved population more frequently than their numbers alone could have warranted, and that there was some indication that Muslims succeeded in the slave structure, that they were promoted and trusted in a particular way. These successes, to return to our concerns about women, these successes belong to men. The historical record of Black Muslims in the Americas consists primarily of planter and administrator references and autobiographical writing by enslaved and free African Muslim men. There are few records of enslaved African Muslim women. Nonetheless, I want to consider the book as a gendered supplement to the activist and organizing work that Shivana, Simone, and Jihadi Sisters are doing around gender and racial justice in the Indo-Caribbean community. One of my concerns is the way in which changing norms of Muslim women's dress are read in the 21st century Caribbean, where race is historically linked to religion. I make two major points about dress in the book. First, that in the contemporary era, Islam is increasingly framed in the Caribbean not as a local religion with a long history in the region, but as I've mentioned, a foreign transnational religion characterized by local adherents' gendered participation in a contemporary global Islam. As in North America and Europe, Islam is viewed in the Caribbean as undergoing a process of conservative Islamization that women's dress makes visible. Second, I use court cases and ethnography to argue that a regional increase in the wearing of hijab, niqab, and other forms of conservative Muslim female and male dress is framed as obstructing post-colonial creolization projects and confusing bodily markers of ethnicity and culture normalized by Anglophone Caribbean nation states. What you're seeing here, this 1964 photograph, is how some Muslim women looked in British Guyana in 1964. They look very 60s fashionable. You can tell from the hairdos, the beehives. It's a little different now. You might more typically see something like this, where people have adopted a kind of generic Muslim look that is essentially Gulf Arab style. It is no longer quite so Indian. Muslim women have always been presumed to be different from other women in Trinidad and Guyana, even from other Indo-Caribbean women. They're capable of marrying earlier, tolerating greater family interference and restrictions on their lives, and in general, submitting to patriarchal practices without complaint. One example of the way in which Muslim women are perceived as an ultimate other in the Caribbean is through Trinidad's Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, which, until amended by a recent parliamentary act in 2017, stipulated that Muslim boys could be married at the age of 16 and Muslim girls could be married at the age of 12, the youngest permissible age for anyone to marry in Trinidad. And again, this was only changed in 2017. Hindu girls were allowed to marry at the age of 14, the second youngest, girls of other faiths at 16, and all other boys at 18. The rationale for allowing Muslim girls to marry so early at the age of 12 was that it was a nod to Muslim community practice and to the fact that Sharia Islamic law in its most conservative iteration allows girls to marry at the age of 9. To return again to what Simone and Shivana were saying, it is really difficult for Indo-Caribbean women to escape debates over piety and over their representation and their embodiment of the community's own piety. As Saba Mahmood, Leila Abu Lugad, Leila Ahmed, Fatima Mernissi, and numerous other feminists writing about women in Islam have shown, paternalistic Western antipathy toward the hijab, veil, and burqa on behalf of Muslim women is a foundational part of the discourse on Islam that serves to conceal neocolonial agendas. Leila Ahmed writes that from the 19th century on, calls for unveiling came already marked with notions of who was civilized and who was not, and already replete with the markings of colonizer, colonized, and European, non-European. What I'm arguing here is that the visibility of women's Islamic dress has made them in the Caribbean the scapegoats for national discomfort with the non-creolized difference posed by Muslims. In the Caribbean, Muslim religious particularity threatens 20th century discourses of post-colonial belonging, which call for creolization and ethnic and cultural hybridity as conditions of citizenship. I'll stop here now to have further conversation.
Thank you very much, Aliyah. I wanted to invite the attendees to use the question and answer function on Zoom, and we will be looking at it and potentially takes one or more questions from there. But I wanted to see if Rajiv, Simone, and Shivana had any comment or response. I was particularly struck about the answer, the accent on the question or dimension of ancestrality of the ancestors. How much that came through the three presentations. I mean, all of your 4 presentations, and I could say much more about that, but I'm sure that each of you can say much more about that. I wonder if there is something else that you would add with respect to that after listening to each other. And also, you point out to you as descendants of those ancestors that are now linked, and Aliyah pointed out the way in which Far From Mecca could be seen, and I quote her, as a supplement to the kind of work that one sees Jihadi Sisters doing, right? And Rajiv talked about Far From Mecca as this kind of treasure of devices, potential poetic devices that can nourish, that can provide new terms and rhythms and contents for his poetry. So there is that kind of linkage to the community already occurring, which I hope that this book launch helps to cement and even further. But I'm also thinking about a topic that I know that is also of your interest, the relevance of interreligious and interracial kind of solidarities and connection, right? So we have ancestrality, then the linkage between the descendants of the ancestors, the community of struggles, the supplementation, the way in which the works that you do in different areas and different spheres can nourish each other, can strengthen each other. And then we have the possibility of connecting in the Indo-Caribbean community, right? In that internal plurality, interreligious forms of connection for survival and more and thriving, but also against the legacy of anti-Black racism, radical forms of solidarity. And I wonder if you could talk of any of those themes and put it on the table for consideration too. Maybe we can, I mean, you can go whoever has an immediate response, but if not, we can also use the same order that we used before.
Well, maybe I can start and then others can kind of riff off of me. I mean, one of the things that Rajiv talked about that I felt was just really on point, right, for where Jihadi is at right now in our racial justice movement work is how much of a need there is for us to throw down for Black folks right now in this political moment. And so we've been trying to do a lot of that awakening work in our own community and have been doing workshops with folks on anti-Blackness and really trying to do it in a culturally competent way that lays bare our unique history with Africans in the Caribbean, both related to the discrimination and tensions and violence between the groups, but also sharing and educating people about the solidarity, because I feel like one of the things that colonialism and white dominated narrative does to us is makes us feel like we were always this way. We were always so polarized, right? So that we cannot imagine a future where there is solidarity and where we are actually working hand in hand for our joint liberation. And, for us at Jihadi Sisters, it's so imperative that we center Black women, Black trans women in the gender justice work that we do. And we believe that in order to win and get to that day when patriarchy is successfully smashed, we really need to be centering the most marginalized, right? Because it's not until the most marginalized get free that we all can be free. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, the reason that we ourselves as brown folk face racism is because there's anti-Blackness to begin with, right? Like we face racism as a result of our proximity to Blackness, and it is very much wrapped up in capitalism, right? And who is considered Black or close to Black has evolved over time, and that's going to continue to happen unless we really just address racial injustice against Black folks once and for all. So it's something that is really incredibly important to us, and we're trying to do a lot of work for ourselves internally, and then also taking it outward to the public education level. Yeah, so I'll just stop there and see if anyone else wants to jump in, and I might have some other thoughts too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to say also to marvel at the multidisciplinarity of this book and of this text and how it comes to us. It's reading songs, poems, prose, dress, styles of dress, various interviews. And I think that this can show us how, it just feels like such a metaphor for, kind of Indo-Caribbean identity in the States too, right? Like when we talk about where we're from and who we are, it's like, oh yeah, but there's this thing, I'm from here, I'm from here, I'm from here, I do this thing. And there's so many solidarities and potentials for interreligious solidarities and, solidarities that are interethnic as well, that are woven into this kind of framework. And thinking about the multidisciplinarity as a kind of framework for understanding the way that we move in the world. I know that I definitely, through poems, I'm interested not just in form, but in just kind of meaning. Why go to a poem if you're not going to change something or move something? That said, Munshi Rahman Khan, who was a Surinamese poet that Aliyah alludes to in the book, as an invocation, I was going to start with one of his poems, but I decided, like in translation, but I decided not to. But this poem is it goes through this history of the ship called the Lalruk, and when it came to Paramaribo, containing 408 people, he shows the way that people under this kind of the new capitalist system, extractive colonialism, that these indentured laborers were faced. It was through this economic kind of appellation of coolie that they were able to create solidarities where they were each other's support in grief, etc. And then thinking again about like the Calypso song that Aliyah talks about in the book as well, as being one of those potential sites of thinking of extending Jihadi Bhai, Jihadi Behen to be inclusive, right? I mean, where are the boundaries in terms of ways that we can let people in and to show up for people? And I think, like, speaking to Shivana, what you had just said, as well as connecting it to Nelson, your question of ancestrality and the ways that we are connected. It's like, yeah, there are these kinds of like foregrounded kind of ways that solidarities have existed, that the job of colonization is to make us forget this, right? And so it is through these projects like Aliyah's that we are able to kind of like see how this has worked. Like, Islam has been in the Western Hemisphere for longer than Indian indenture, and that's such an important thing to remember in terms of how we think about ourselves in time and history.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love that Dr. Khan does is, you lift up the resistance of our people, and there are not a lot of places where that happens, right? And I feel like the resistance is always because we worked on sugar plantations. The resistance is labor resistance. And as an activist, as a movement leader, I think about the fact that class is the thing that will unite so many of us, and for South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans, I feel like this hang up with looking good, right? And pretending that we're well off and not struggling really, really gets in the way of us building with Black Americans and Latino folks, and means that there are less people to fight the good fight and to win and to change the power structure in this country and beyond, right, around the world. And so I love the fact that you lift up from fiction and from real life the stories of labor resistance, because then we're able to say to our organizers and our members, like, actually, this is in our blood. Sumintra and Kausila, these are our ancestors. Like, let us look to them and learn from them as idols. What we're doing here is not new. It's actually what we were built for. And we are here because our ancestors sent us to do this work and to organize our people to create change, So I feel like that is a gift to our community.
Ooh, this is such a great dialogue happening right now. I mean, I am like, when we think about the work that we're doing at Jihadi Sisters, it's about building power in our community, right? It's about bringing folks together who wouldn't typically come together. Like, it's bringing Hindu, Muslim, Christian women together, working class people together, folks who have historically been marginalized and have not been seen. And so, like, I wonder, like, Aliyah, because I know there's a part in your book where you talk about, like, the first the Trinidadian doctor who gave the first lecture in the mosque in Trinidad, and how, like, groundbreaking that was. And it wasn't just groundbreaking for the Muslim community, but it was groundbreaking for all Indo-Caribbean women, right? To have something like that happen. And so like when we're thinking about the work that we're doing on the ground and us wanting to build solidarity, because the only way we can build solidarity with the Black community and with those who are even most deeply impacted by violence is if we start with our own community and we start with ourselves, right? So what is it going to take for us to build deeper solidarity with the Indo-Caribbean Muslim community, which is so deep, which is even more deeply marginalized, right? Like in our work, we were co-founded by an Indo-Caribbean Muslim woman and that was the time when we were able to reach the most Muslim women in our work. But it's been harder, you know, it's been really hard. Like the majority of people who still show up to our work are Hindu women. So how do we like actually do the work in a much more intentional and deeper way where we can reach the folks in our community that are most deeply impacted by gender-based violence, you know? And I'm not saying that's Muslim women alone, but like, what is it going to take for us to really build that power and that solidarity for our community so we can do it beyond our community?
I have a million things that I could say here, but I want to, address this question that Simone just raised about how do you reach people? I mean, that is the perennial organizing question, right? Like, how do you reach the people that not needed the most in a paternalistic sense, but, who in some way do? I mean, how do you reach Indo-Muslim people? One of the arguments that I make, not just in this book, but just in general, is that you do have to reach them through their religious spaces. And like, that is how they live, that is how they work. You go into the mosques, right? You meet people in the mosques, you meet people on the ground. How do you reach men is a question, when you're doing this kind of domestic violence work that you all are doing, is a question that I don't have, fair answers to. But it is one that I have been, thinking about when you're thinking about like the high rates of suicide amongst Indo-Caribbean men, and Indo-Guyanese men in particular, in like rural areas in Guyana and amongst like sugar workers and so on. What I'm saying here is that my entry point is a religious one, right? Because people are so very much like, regardless of whatever else they are doing, they do show up for those religious holidays. They do show up for, these particular religious rituals and performances throughout their lives, like no matter how devoted they are, they show up for the religious stuff and for the religious holidays and so on. That is one way. In terms of like the questions of like anti-Blackness and racial solidarity that Shivana and other people raised, I think that one serious organizing gap that exists is that we have been talking primarily about anti-Blackness and thinking about relationships between Black and Indian communities in New York. But there is that other situation of how it is in the Caribbean, and how you relate to what is happening in the Caribbean when every single time that there is an election in Guyana, and to a slightly lesser extent in Trinidad, there is violent racial conflict between Indians and Black people up to last year, right? You all know, up to last summer. What do we do with that? Like, how do we address this very real kind of racial trauma and this like history of violence that is what informs the older generation of Indo-Caribbean immigrants to the United States, who have a different relationship and a different understanding of racial relations between Indian and Black people than their second generation children have here when they're thinking about anti-Blackness? Like, how do you speak to your parents when their understanding of it is a local Caribbean one, right? And they have felt so traumatized by what happened in the Caribbean that they don't even care to hear the language of like activism and wokeness of their second generation or their 1.5 generation children. So, I think that is a gap that we need to think about as like scholars, poets, activists. Like, how do you make the jump between like these kinds of racial relationships in the Caribbean itself and the organizing ones on the ground in the diaspora?
And that is one of those gaps that demand, I think, this kind of plural forms of work, of intellectual production in the ground while organizing, while drafting verses and poems, and also while looking at the archives and cultural production, trying to make sense of them. All of these and more forms are needed to engage in that combat for lost memory, and combat also for forms of relationality that we have been there to ignore. Rajiv says something about forgetfulness, about we forgetting our ancestors, that this is part of the work of colonialism and coloniality. And when he was saying that, I was thinking, well, and poetry can be that kind of a form of incantation to bring back the memory, to engage in a counter colonial practice of meaning creation that leads to these forms of healing and creating new memories and new forms of connection. And we received a number of questions in the chat and comments, very enthusiastic comments, a number of questions, some of which has been addressed by the conversation. We are already beyond the time, but I think that we do have time for at least a closing point that helps us to precisely ends with this note of helping us to remember and helping us also to refocus on the act of, what we're saying, calling here today combativity in multiple fronts and in relation to each other, developing forms of communication that bring these different aspects of our work, community creation and community action, translation, poetry production, teaching, research together. So with that, I want to thank everybody who has participated in this, our inaugural Combative book launch. I do want, though, before we pass it to Rajiv, to give an opportunity to any of you, Aliyah, Simone, and Shivana, who may want to say anything else to end. But I want also to thanks also everyone who has attended and everyone who has supported Rutgers University Press, Rutgers University School of Arts and Sciences that supports the Institute. Thanks to the co-directors of the Critical Caribbean Studies book series. This is one of their wonderful texts, and we look forward for many more to come, hopefully in this very combative spirit. Thank you so much. I will say goodbye, and I will leave it to Aliyah, Simone, Shivana, to say any concluding comments, and then Rajiv to close us off.
In the spirit of solidarity, I'll just say that it's so beautiful to know that Jose in Guyana and Trinidad was celebrated by both Indo and Afro-Caribbean people, and that you would find Afro-Caribbean people drumming and like that intermingling and celebration together. I think it's so beautiful and something that we definitely need to lift up more when we address the trauma that our families still hold around anti-Blackness.
I just want to say thank you again for not just the book, but also, all of you who organized this, for creating this space, because I think it's so critical that across sectors we have these kinds of dialogues, right? Because then we can have cross-pollination and, we get ideas that will inform our organizing, and maybe y'all have learned something from us that you can take back to your work. And, this is how we build it together, and we get to where I think we all want to go. So like, even this for me feels like organizing and community building. So if I could make a request for more of it, I will do that. And I hope that we can keep having these conversations.
I'll briefly say thank you again to all of the organizers, and then to all of my interlocutors. I really feel what you just said, Shivana. This feels like we're doing organizing work, like right now, right? That we're generating ideas for how to do some productive work, not just for you as organizers, but also for me, and thinking about how to approach some of my work academically. And then Simone, that point you made, and it was also, somebody brought it up in the Q&A about the Muslim festival of Hussein or Muharram being this like really important moment of creolization in the Muslim Caribbean at the end of the 19th century. We really do need to point out that that really crucial foundational moment of Hussein and Muharram as a point of unity, a moment, a festival moment, a carnival moment of unity between Indian and Black Caribbean people, was disrupted by the British, right, who outlawed it in both Guyana and Trinidad because they saw that it was dangerous to the colonization project, right? And it was ended in Trinidad by the Muharram massacre, right, where British soldiers actively shot people who were participating in the festival. So it is not that we never had these moments of creolization and solidarity amongst Indian and Black people in the English-speaking Caribbean. It's that they were disrupted by colonial authorities in their nascent moments. And they continue to be so as a result of, they continue to be so in the Cold War, which we know, from the work of like Walter Rodney and a little bit before, and then all of these other people. And then, the active CIA intervention in Cold War politics in Guyana and in other places in the Caribbean to prevent a quote unquote another Cuba. So, there are all of these moments of solidarity, community generated, bottom up organizing grassroots solidarity that we can point to that were actively disrupted by first the British and then, the United States and all of these imperialist projects that, it is our work to undo.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you also, Aliyah, for asking me to be here tonight with you. And thank you to Simone and Shivana for such a wonderful ideas. And it does feel like we're coming together in this organizing kind of way. So I'll leave you with a short poem tonight. I was going to read a longer one that goes between English and Creole. And this poem is called, instead, it's called Why Whales Are Back in New York City. After a century, humpbacks migrate again to Queens. They left due to sewage and white froth, banking the shores from polychlorinated biphenyl dumping into the Hudson and winnowing Manhattan schools. But now grace, dark bodies of song return. Go to the seaside, hold your breath, submerge. A black fluke silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline. Now ICE beats doors down on Liberty Avenue to deport. I sat alone on orange A-train seats, mouth sparkling from Sing's doubles. No matter how white supremacy gathers at the sidewalks, floats down the streets, we still beat our drums wild. Watch their false god statues prostrate to black and brown hands. They won't keep us out, though they send us back. Our songs will pierce the dark fathoms. Behold the miracle. What was once lost now leaps before you.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Thanks to everybody. And it will be until the next time. Thank you.